I'm Mike Farrington, welcome back to my shop, aka the boardroom. Let's take a look at my first Fine Woodworking article. In this video we'll closely parallel the article and I'll show my process for creating the gridwork of equilateral triangles with a super secret table saw sled. I'd also like to say thanks to Fine Woodworking and also mention what an honor it is to be in the pages of Fine Woodworking. I've been a subscriber to the magazine for probably more than 15 years now, and it's really provided a great source of inspiration for me, and hopefully my article will do the same for others. And I get started by milling up some walnut and Doug fir lumber to 1/2 inch thickness. And I make sure that both ends are nice and square. And once the blanks are squared up, I install a zero clearance insert with a splitter into my table saw, and I rip off a whole bunch of strips that are just over 1/8 of an inch thick. Once I think I have enough strips roughed out of the table saw, I mosey on over to the workbench and I pull out my thicknessing jig. And this jig, along with my trusty block plane, allow me to precisely thickness these strips down to 1/8 of an inch, which matches the kerf of my table saw blade. So let's take a closer look at the anatomy of this thicknessing jig. And really this is a simple jig. I start with a bed of MDF and I add 2 MDF runners that are sized for my block plane. And installed in between the runners is a stop block, and I size the stop block so that it doesn't interfere with the travel of the block plane. And a quick tip, don't glue this stop block in place. Use a couple deeply countersunk screws. You want to make sure that they're deeply countersunk so that you don't nick your nicely sharpened plane blade. Don't ask me how I know that. This stop block will get beat up, and it's important to be able to replace it easily. Also installed between the runners is what I refer to as a shim, and I just use this shim to adjust the thickness of the strips being planed, and a piece of painter's tape allows a very fine adjustment of that thickness. And I have a few different shims laying around that allow me to plane strips from 1/16 of an inch thick all the way up to 1/4 of an inch thick. And I like to leave this little overhang here so it makes the jig easy to clamp to my workbench top. Getting this jig set up perfectly can be a little finicky, but once it's set up, it stays that way permanently, as you can unscrew the shim, put it back in, and it'll come right back to that same setting. And I cut a test kerf in a scrap piece, and then I plane a strip to thickness and see how they fit. Once a nice slip fit is achieved, this jig is ready to rumble. Next item to build is the super secret table saw sled. The dimensions of this sled are mentioned in the article, but the reality is each sled's going to have to be fitted to a particular table saw depending on its size. After cutting out the base of the sled, I grab a piece of quarter sawn red oak and I make a runner. And it's absolutely critical that this runner have no play when sliding in the miter slot. And in fact, it should have a little friction when it's being pushed back and forth in the miter slot. Next, I mark the rough location of a shallow dado that's going to house the runner. And I start by making a few passes just to get most of the material out of the way, and then I make little minute adjustments at the end until I get a nice friction fit. In the video here, I show myself making one tiny adjustment and nailing the fit. In reality, I had to make 5 or 6 adjustments to get the fit just right. With the dado sized perfectly, I go ahead and glue the runner in place. While the glue is drying, let's talk about saw blades. I use 3 different saw blades for Kumiko work. The first is just a good old-fashioned circular saw blade. It has a 5/8 inch arbor, so it fits right in my table saw, and it cuts a 1/16 inch kerf. The second blade I use is a thin kerf blade, which has a 3/32 inch kerf, and the last saw blade that I use is a full kerf blade, which has a 1/8 inch kerf. The reason I mention this and the reason I use 3 different saw blades is that the thickness of the strips must match the kerf of the saw blade perfectly. Next, I mark the location of the saw blade with the sled in place. Then I measure over from there where I want my registration key located. This sets what's known as the pitch of your gridwork. That's the distance between the lap joints. I cut this groove about 3/16 of an inch deep, and in this case I'm using my 1/8 inch kerf blade. Once this groove is cut, this sled is married to that blade. There's no going back and using a different thickness blade. At this point I add a front and back fence, and this holds the sled together. I also add a small roundover to give it a more professional appearance and feel. The next step is to add the two angled fences, and I start by drilling 4 generously sized pilot holes. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of different ways to set the angle of these fences. I'll just show 2. The first is to use a bevel setting gauge and a sliding T-bevel. Also, I'd just like to mention that I'm using the same reference edge to set this angle as I did to cut the dado for the runner as well as the groove for the registration key. I think using the same edge for all 3 of these processes helps with accuracy. Another way to set the angles would be to use a 30-60 drafting triangle, and I am referencing it off my saw fence, but I know that my saw fence is parallel to my miter slot. And this is actually my preferred method. I line everything up real good, press down with my left hand, and drive a screw home with my right. When attaching the second fence, it's important to leave clearance for the workpiece. Here's one of the reasons for the generous pilot holes. As I tighten the screw, the fence shifted a little bit, so it's easy enough to just loosen the screw a little, make an adjustment, tighten it back up, and it's ready to go. Next, it's time for the sled's maiden voyage across my mighty table saw. Next, I add the registration keys. I cut a 30-degree angle so that it butts tightly to the fence. These registration keys are just made from cut down strips that I planed earlier. And I wanted a few extra style points, so I spray painted a clearly defined no finger zone. Here I'm demonstrating with my articulate hand gestures that the fences can be positioned in the opposite direction, and you can use either miter slot to build the sled. Really, you should think about what would work best for your saw. And now the rubber meets the road. Here is the table saw sled in action. On this first series of cuts, the blade height is set to 1/3 the height of the strip, and a cut is made on both sides. And it is vitally important that the strip be butted up against the registration key very tightly. Any variation there and the pieces will not be cut accurately. Once the first 2 cuts are made, it's actually a real easy process. You just slide the piece over onto the registration key, make another cut, flip it over, make another cut, and just continue on down the line. It's also real important to keep the area around the registration key clean. Sometimes dust can build up there, and then that alters the positioning of the piece slightly, and then the cuts don't come out accurate. And now I'm set up for the second series of cuts. I have raised the blade height to 2/3 the height of the strip, and again it is very important to butt the initial cut up against the registration key. When making this series of cuts, I'm using my right hand to hold the piece very tightly against the registration key. After making the necessary cuts on the fence that's closer to me, I move to the fence that's further away. This last set of cuts is the most tricky. The reason being the angle between the fence and the registration key is obtuse, and therefore it is a little more difficult to line up that corner right with the edge of that registration key. But as long as the first cut is lined up correctly, subsequent cuts will be spot on. If there is a little slop after making the first cut and positioning the strip over the registration key, all is not lost. I like to take my right hand and press the piece kind of down into the corner of the registration key and the fence towards the blade. I find that that will help make the most accurate cuts. If the sled was made accurately, there will be little points created by the 2 angle cuts. Those points will be centered on the thickness of the strip. And if the points are not centered, I go back to basics. I check all the angles, I make sure that my table saw is set up correctly, and usually that solves the problem. And here's a look at how all of this goes together. Note the little points are centered on the thickness of the strip. Shazam! There it is. Now that all the lap joints are cut, I assemble the grids. And I didn't show it here, but a dot of glue from a toothpick on each one of these lap joints is a good idea. And because I didn't make enough the first time, it's back to the thicknessing jig to make some more strips for the infill pieces. And the infill pieces are a great place to use any strips that were rejected during the grid making process. So pieces would tear out, or if I cut something wrong on the table saw, oftentimes I can use part of that strip to create some infill pieces. And if nothing else, Kumiko is a repetitive process. It will certainly test your patience. All of the infill pieces need angles cut on the ends, and I prefer to use a block plane and this simple jig. And really, these jigs are just a miniature miter box with a sliding stop block. These jigs are used to cut the angles on the ends of the infill pieces, and they're also used to set the length of the infill pieces, and I'll demonstrate that in a few minutes. Once in a while I find this face needs to be trued up, and the chop saw makes quick work of that. So I'm going to show a couple different infills, and the first one is known as Asa no Ha. And I'm using what I describe as a 60-degree jig, and that would be 60 degrees from a standpoint of a miter saw, assuming it could adjust over that far. And I always like to start with the steeper angles first, and do one side, flip it over, do the other, and it creates a perfectly centered point. And next I move on to the 30-degree jig, and again, that's from the standpoint of a miter saw. And in this shot, I'm just adjusting the stop block to cut the piece ever so slightly shorter. Take a few passes on either side, and then I test the fit so that all three pieces of the Asa no Ha pattern fit in nicely. And with this version of the Asa no Ha pattern, all the pieces are cut to the same length with the same angles. Now that all the infill pieces are completed, it's time to finish off the grid work. Because the grid work is made up of a bunch of triangles, it makes it difficult to determine a stopping point. And my solution is to use the 60-degree jig to put a point on one side of a piece, 90-degree butt joint on the other side, and I like to use a ruler to make sure that these have all been installed straight. And I think this creates a nice stopping point for the grid work. And because this is the perimeter and these pieces will be under a bit more stress when I cut off the excess, I like to use a good amount of glue. And speaking of cutting off the excess, I think there's two good ways to do this. A disc sander makes quick work of this. It's also a nice, safe way to cut it off. The other option is just a flush cut saw, and this works good too. Next, it's time to move on to the frames. The frames are going to have two layers, an inner layer and an outer layer. The inner layer will have no finish applied to it, and the outer layer will have some finish applied for a nice contrast. So after roughing out some pieces, I head over to the router table and I put a very shallow rabbet on the inside edge of these frame pieces. Probably a heavy 32nd of an inch, something like that. And the deeper this rabbet is cut, the more it's going to cover up the grid work, so I keep this as small as possible. And to make sure that these are really close to perfectly sized, I use a marking knife to mark a line. I cut away the excess with the handsaw, and I plane right up to my line. For whatever reason, during this build, I went on a Pink Floyd bender, and I listened to several Pink Floyd albums beginning to end. And I have to say, one of my most very favorite is The Division Bell. From beginning to end, that album is awesome. Every song is good. And I think the mood of the album works well with the repetitive, quiet nature of Kumiko. So, if you're in the mood, I suggest you listen to the album The Division Bell by Pink Floyd. And I made the outer frames in the exact same manner, with the only difference being I applied some finish. Now it's time to install the infill permanently. I'd like to take just a couple minutes to show a few variations. This first one is known as Asa no Ha, and it's supposed to represent a hemp leaf. And this second pattern is called Sakura, and it represents a cherry blossom. And if you're interested in how I make the 6 pieces that make up the center of the cherry blossom, I have another video on my channel where I build a couple Japanese lanterns and I show the process for making those pieces. And the possibilities of mixing and matching are endless. If you find yourself really enjoying Kumiko, there are hundreds of patterns to explore. And the last task to do before final assembly is to install some rice paper. And I'm installing it with double-sided tape, also known as carpet tape, and I'm using a synthetic rice paper. And last but not least, I put everything in the frames. Overall, I'm pleased with the end results, and I had a lot of fun building these 2 wall pieces. And it was a really neat experience to work with Fine Woodworking on this project. But more importantly, I'm excited to share this method of cutting the triangular gridwork with you. I hope you find it useful, and if not useful, maybe interesting. Thanks for watching. Till next time. Thank you for watching all the way to the end of the video. I greatly appreciate it. Also, thank you for joining me here on this snowy Colorado afternoon in what will be my next video. I'm remodeling this room and turning it into a proper nursery for our next little kiddo who will be here in just a few short weeks. If you like what you saw in the video, I'll have a link in the description below that'll take you to the article. There you'll find a little more information such as dimensions on the jigs and a few other small details that weren't included in the video. Also, I wanted to mention that Fine Woodworking has a new program out. It's called Fine Woodworking Unlimited, and essentially what it is a subscription to their print magazine as well as access to all of their online content. Right now they're offering a free 2-week trial, so you can check it out and see if it's a good fit for you. After the 2-week trial period, if you feel my channel merits support, sign up for Fine Woodworking Unlimited using the link below, and Fine Woodworking will give me a referral fee. This is a great way to help out my channel if you're interested in doing so. Lastly, if you're wondering why I'm standing next to a stack of magazines on top of a ladder, I wanted to demonstrate to you that I'm not just trying to sell you something. I'm a fan of the magazine. I've been a subscriber for many years, so why not proudly display them atop a 4-foot A-frame ladder?